We're here today to reflect on Athlete A, a new documentary from Netflix that profiles the first gymnast to report Dr. Larry Nassar's abuse to USA Gymnastics, and a profile as well of the team of the Indy Star reporters who began investigating the numerous claims of abuse. But it also is in a very compelling fashion, looks deeply into the culture at USA Gymnastics, which enabled this abuse. Today we'll talk about the film, but our ultimate goal is to share insight about how to responsibly cover sexual abuse and assault, how the media can provide a safe space for survivors to tell their stories, and how investigative journalism can hold the powerful accountable, including when it comes to sexual violence in sports. So I want to start first with some reflections on the film. It moved me. I found it incredibly powerful. And I want to ask Marisa first about her take on the film, since her work and her colleagues' work is at the center of the narrative. So Marisa, can you talk a little bit first about just watching that film, what it meant to you to see that?
Well, first of all, it's always strange to see yourself on screen, right? It's like hearing your own voice. You know, the filmmakers were incredibly kind to my colleagues and I and the work that we had done. When I look at that experience, the thing that sticks out to me is the incredible amount of trust that people placed in us to share their stories, because being on the other side of it and being followed by filmmakers and trusting that they are going to present our work accurately and fairly and share our stories with integrity, that takes a lot of trust. And so I think for me, in looking at the film, and I will say that they met that with integrity, it's a reminder of the incredible amount of trust that people place in us when we write these kinds of stories.
Courtney, can you share with us some of your thoughts on the film and what it meant to you?
First of all, congratulations on a really powerful film. I mean, what really stood out to me is not only the bravery of these young women and what they had to endure, but their bravery in speaking out, and what an important role that Marisa and her colleagues played in helping to bring justice in this situation, and really the critical role that investigative journalism plays, frankly, that any journalism plays when those in power are not held to account, when there is really no meaningful avenue to achieve justice other than publicity. And, just watching the time and care that the team took to work with the athletes who were sharing incredibly powerful and challenging experiences, making sure that they had all of their facts in order before going to publication. It really emphasizes how important journalism is, and really how it is different than other forms of, sharing on social media or opining in whatever format you want to focus on. The fact is that journalism is devoted to uncovering the truth, to reporting the facts, to making sure that you have those facts before going to publication. I can only imagine how frustrating it must have been for some of the women who decided to come forward. Sometimes there's a lag time between when they talk to a reporter and when it goes live. And also the sort of pressure and potential threats that the reporters faced in doing this story, knowing that they were taking on a very powerful institution, very powerful individual, and USA Gymnastics. I think that's one of the most watched sports for the Olympics. I know, I grew up as a young woman in America watching gymnastics as my favorite sports at the Olympics. So overall, it was an incredibly powerful and moving story of courage on the part of the athletes and on the part of the reporters working together to uncover this story.
So well said. And I also grew up watching gymnastics, even though I was a soccer player. It was my favorite thing to watch on television. I think one of the heartbreaking things about the film is that you are watching these powerful, incredible athletes, and then you realize what they were coping with, what they were subjected to, what they were dealing with. And to your point, only the journalists could tell this story because they took the time and the care. So Katie, I also want to hear from you if you had thoughts to share about the film as well.
I mean, I echo what everyone else has said to date. I mean, it's a really powerful film from a personal sort of human perspective. I mean, it's difficult to watch and not be both infuriated by what these young women had to go through. At the same time, it's very inspiring. I mean, the bravery that they displayed, it's very powerful. I think as someone who works with journalists, as an attorney that works with journalists on a day-to-day basis, I think it's also really a testament to the power of investigative journalism, as Courtney said. And it's sort of in that great tradition of, though it's a documentary and Spotlight was a dramatic film based on a true story, it's sort of in that great tradition of showing the power of investigative journalism that's really well done, and how it can't only, it can change the lives of the people who are being reported on, but it can also really fundamentally change systems of abuse, which I think is a really important, the film did a nice job, I think, of highlighting not just the impact on these individuals, but I think pulling back and looking at the bigger picture, the systemic problems within USA Gymnastics that so desperately needed to be changed.
And I think the strength is, as we've all been saying, right, at the core, the foundation of this movie and the foundation of the story, when it was broken by the Indy Star, was the relationship the reporters and then later the filmmakers had with their sources, the survivors. And one thing I was reflecting on is when I started reporting on sexual assault almost a decade ago, I was looking at sexual assault in the military as it was emerging in our daily news cycle. And I was in a very large, well-resourced newsroom that I love and I have no complaints about. But one thing I reflected on is the fact that at the time, it didn't feel like there was anyone person I could go to and say, what are the best practices for reporting on sexual assault or sexual abuse? And this is something I think that's common in newsrooms, like which sort of like, reporters love to just go at a subject and as people have been saying, uncover the truth, right? But sometimes there's this foundation that you don't get in best practices around trauma-informed interviewing, around working with sources that have gone through violence of different types, especially sexual violence. So let's talk about how reporters can build those relationships with sensitivity, with care, with best practices. And Marisa, maybe let's start with you and ask what you learned in that experience and what your best practices have become.
So all of my colleagues and I had written about topics like this prior to this investigation. Tim Evans and myself in particular had done a lot writing about child abuse, child sexual abuse prior to this investigation. And sort of what we've learned, and I think has only been solidified as we've continued to do stories like this, is the importance of communication. And when you talk about relationship building with sources, especially when we're talking about people who may have experienced trauma, how incredibly important it is to communicate before you ask a single question, to communicate during that process to help them understand not only why you want to talk to them, but sort of how that process is going to work, what their expectations can be once the interview itself is over. And then to what Courtney was talking about earlier, continuing to communicate after that interview, because there could be, months between when you've asked them to share this incredibly personal story and when it might appear in publication. And so, for us, it's really about communicating at the front end, saying, this is why I want to talk to you, how your story fits into what we're looking at, and why we're going to be asking you these detailed questions that we might be asking you. And again, it's your story. If there's something that you're not comfortable sharing with us, please let us know. It's your story. You own that story. And then continuing to communicate afterwards, saying, hey, I just want to let you know, like, this is where we're at. You can expect it might be another month or two, but I'll keep you in the loop. That way, no one's surprised either. For some of the survivors, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this as well, they've tried to tell someone before, they've tried to communicate before, and in some cases it did not go well. Either they weren't believed or there was no follow-up. And so it's really, not only is it the right thing to do, but it's incredibly important throughout that process to make sure that we are giving that communication throughout.
I want to add to and get other thoughts from Katie and Courtney about this, but the issue of cooperation is really difficult, right? Because you have to go to a survivor and say, I'm going to ask you these really difficult, detailed questions about your experience, and then I need to fact check them, basically. I need to corroborate them. I need to make sure that we're doing our best to have the case airtight, right? Let's talk about that experience for sources and how journalists can navigate them and navigate through the challenge of telling someone, okay, I may have to ask the perpetrator, right? Like in the next few weeks. Or I have to call your mom. I have to call your best friend. Let's talk about some of those, how that works.
So at the Committee to Protect Journalists, while we're reporting on typically different types of attacks, it's the same principle. Many of the people, the Committee to Protect Journalists in one sense is a news service where we focus solely on reporting on attacks against journalists. That could be murder, it could be arrest, physical, sexual, digital, all sorts of different types of attacks. And it is very challenging because as journalists, we need to make sure that we do have double sourcing for all of that. And so we need to confirm the account. And that can be really challenging because not only, as you said, might you have to talk to the perpetrator or to the agency involved, you might not be able to confirm it. And then that can also lead to some really challenging dynamics. And then also, of course, these, whereas they show up in stories, as names, they're people, we're in contact with them on a daily basis. I think one of the benefits of the type of reporting that CPJ does is we're also able to provide assistance through our emergencies program, both physical, digital, and psychosocial. And that's really important because when you're talking to these reporters, for us, the reporters, about the threats that they're under, it's usually something that is not just a one-time thing, and it could be ongoing. And it's a huge challenge. And I think if we look at how the media is able to report on very sensitive issues, you can tell when there's that level of trust in, for example, the reporting that you saw from the Indy Star, and of course the documentarians who then had to, re-report everything. So, it's definitely a challenge, but you can see that pay off, I think, through the trust that obviously the Indy Star garnered by having so many other journalists come forward to tell their stories. So many other athletes come forward to tell their stories. And similar at CPJ, we see journalists turning to us because we have built that reputation for trustworthy, reliable reporting. And then you see that we will get sought out so that people can tell their stories about what the threats they're facing are.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in a little bit of a different spot than both Courtney and Marisa, in the sense that I'm not a reporter. I'm an attorney that helps reporters. We often deal with journalists, or we when we're talking about sourcing issues, we're often dealing with those from the perspective of advising about potential liability, for example. But one of the things that we found, and one of the things that I really, really enjoyed actually about the documentary, is that what we often end up recommending, which can relieve some of the burden on the sources, I think, is to look for documents as sources. And I really appreciated that the film really highlighted a lot of the use of the documents that Marisa and her team used to tell the story, to corroborate some of the information that was provided to them by the sources, to take, for lack of a better way to put it, some of the burden off of them as individuals, because you have this sort of documentary evidence that you can turn to. There are a whole host of sort of liability reasons why it's great to rely on documents. I'm sure Marisa's lawyers talked to her a lot about those reasons. But I think it also can just help, flesh out the story. And like I said, take a little bit of that sort of burden of relying so heavily on the human sources. And I would, just to echo something Courtney said, I think you saw this in the film as well, and hopefully I'm not giving away too many spoilers, but I think once sometimes it's that first story, and I'm sure Marisa can speak to this, right? It's that first story that's once you get that nailed down, and once that's able to come out, you actually have other people, other survivors, who at that point see that story and are willing to come forward and give you more and more corroborating information or additional information that you didn't have to help you report more. So sometimes it's that initial story itself being published that can be a breakthrough to helping you tell the rest of the story that you've been working on.
Marisa, did you have anything you wanted to add based on some of the things that we just ran over?
No, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Katie and Courtney said. We did rely, and you see some of that in the film, heavily on documentation. And, as Courtney says, you treat it like you treat any other investigation, right? You're fact-checking information. If a survivor says that the abuse happened at a particular competition, were they at that competition? Was the alleged perpetrator at that competition? Are there police records? Are there court records? Are there mental health records? Are there journal entries? Are there medical records? Are there other types of records? So we're always looking, obviously the voices of people are incredibly important. I think you see that, and the whole world saw that with Larry Nassar's sentencing, where one person being willing to put their name and their voice out in the public realm led to many other survivors being willing to share their voices as well. And so, I think when you're reporting from a journalist perspective, obviously verifying information and making sure we're putting accurate information before the public is paramount. But I love what Katie said, the power of one voice and how that could lead to many other voices, and continues to, throughout, beyond gymnastics, lead to other voices. You saw, as a result of Athlete A coming out, that UK gymnastics and British gymnastics, there have been people who have come forward about what they've experienced as well. So you're seeing a lot of movement, even still, where one voice leads to more.
Yeah, it's a terrific point. And I also want to share with any journalists watching the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, which, if you don't already know about it, is a terrific, terrific resource for not just best practices on reporting on sexual assault, but other types of trauma that your sources may have gone through. I want to talk a little bit about the past few years. It's been 4 years, I believe, since the Indy Star original piece came out. And, we've also during that time had the Me Too movement and its current iteration. And there's been a lot of public conversation about what it means to be a credible source. And I think that there's been a reckoning in journalism, but also in the public consciousness about credibility when talking about sexual assault allegations. So I want to get at this question because I do think it's something that comes up in newsrooms, right? Is that survivor credible? Is that victim credible? And what do we consider credibility? So if we could reflect a little bit on how that may have changed in the past few years, what you may have seen and amongst reporters you've spoken to in different newsrooms, but also, ways that reporters can think about the credibility question in our current moment. Marisa, do you want to start? Maybe have some thoughts on that?
I don't know if I'm the best person to start because honestly, I don't think of it that way. I mean, I don't think of the credible source question when I'm doing reporting. I mean, as I said earlier, right, it's about doing your journalistic due diligence and fact-checking information and speaking to as many people as you can and gathering information, and so I think that we do that regardless of whether it's a story about sexual abuse or a story about a murder or a story about a city council meeting. I think those things remain the same. And so, I think my response to anybody, I guess, who would raise that, though no one's raised that with me in particular, would be treat it like any other investigation and do the due diligence that you need to do.
I love that answer. And I think part of the challenge, right, is that for so many years, survivors who came forward, especially women, were just sort of automatically not seen as credible for various reasons. And so I really deeply appreciate that response because that's the culture that we need to have in newsrooms, right? That it's just like, treat it like any other investigation. Katie and Courtney, did you want to weigh in?
I think I would just, there's that old saying, right, that if you're a journalist and your mom tells you that they love you, that you corroborate it, right? And so I think with respect to the journalists that we work with and who do many different kinds of sensitive stories, I think I don't think that the methodology has changed in terms of how the journalists approach it. But I do think, and I think this might be some of what you're getting at, I do think that the public's consciousness, the way that they receive those kinds of stories, has changed in a really fundamentally meaningful way. I was struck in the film by angry and saddened, I think, as many probably were who watched it, at this sort of vitriolic response that many of the survivors got when their names were made public and they could come forward in connection with the stories about what had happened to them, and then the responses in many cases were of sort of disbelief, worse than that, but certainly not giving credence to what the stories reported. And I think I'd like to think that has changed significantly, particularly in response to the Me Too movement. That the public in general, it's not that the reporting is different, but it's maybe that the public in general has a different perception of, because there's been so much great reporting around this. There's a different perception about kind of, about how to perceive those stories, how to understand the perspective of the victim in a way that maybe we didn't have 10 years ago, or even more like 5 years ago. So I do think that there has been, at least I've seen, a sort of shift in public view that way, even if the journalism hasn't necessarily changed.
One thing about the journalism, though, that I think may be changing in a helpful way for reporting on very sensitive matters like sexual assault is ideally getting away from the he said, she said format, which I think can be really detrimental to survivors of abuse, or really anyone who has, suffered violence, or, is talking about a sensitive matter. And I think you really saw that come through in the reporting that the Indy Star did, this documentary, and then a lot of the best reporting that we see, the ones that win prizes, the ones that move you, are those reports that get away from that framework and focus on delving into the story. So that would be my only addition.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. And I think the he said, she said dynamic often plays into concerns about credibility as it may be viewed by the public. And so I think that's a great point. I want to talk about how time-consuming investigative reporting is, especially in local areas and local papers where the resources may be dwindling or almost non-existent. So how can local reporters, regional reporters, really tackle these stories? What kind of resources are needed? What are the opportunities? What needs to be shored up? I mean, I realize that's a bigger, we could have a whole panel about local journalism, but in the context of this film and this tremendous reporting, let's talk about, local reporting, investigative reporting, and Marisa, maybe you have some lessons learned or a wish list you'd have.
I'll broaden it beyond just this investigation, and then I'll speak a little bit about the resources that this investigation took, because, in many ways, the work that we did and the effort that went into it and the resources that went toward it were extraordinary. And, I'll tell you that I started my career in investigations doing it on the side. So I was a beat reporter, and I was covering government at the time, and I would just chip away an hour here, half an hour there on the longer term investigations that I wanted to do while turning out the daily content, right? That's how I think a lot of people start out, is you're doing that work because it means something to you and it's important, and you just find the time where you can. I am very privileged in my career now where I do investigations full time. And so that's a different type of resource where we were able, Mark Alicia, Tim Evans, and we were full time on this investigation for the better part of 2 years. And our editor, Steve Berta, was pretty much full time with us for that 2-year period. And Robert Shearer, the visual journalist who worked with us exclusively, was also, balancing other duties, but largely dedicated to us. That's an incredible amount of resource for a mid-sized paper. And it was because we had really fantastic editors who believed in the importance of the work that we were doing, and they were putting resources to it. And they were putting resources to it, not just in our local newsroom, but we also had support from Gannett Corporate in terms of Indy Star, Gannett on Indy Star's behalf filed a motion to intervene in the Georgia lawsuit, seeking access to records that had been sealed by the judge. And that took an incredible amount of resource to pursue those. And ultimately we did win. It took 9 months. It went to the Georgia Supreme Court, but that was an immense amount of resources in addition to just the human capital that went into doing this investigation. And so, you know, do I think that's always possible for any investigation? Of course not. I mean, in my career, that's not typical either, but I think I was incredibly fortunate to have bosses who recognized when something was worth that amount of work and needed that amount of resource, and they were willing to commit to it.
Courtney or Katie, did you have thoughts on the question of investigative reporting?
I'll jump in. I spend a lot of my time now at the Reporters Committee focused on how to best provide legal services to reporters who do local enterprise and investigative reporting. And I think the crisis, the economic crisis that's really hit the journalism industry, this is where it hurts. I mean, this is where it hurts the public, I think, most of all. I mean, the amount of resources that Marisa's described, that's a lot of resources into investigative reporting. And the legal resource, I mean, she talked about the legal resources that were required for unsealing work. We do at the Reporters Committee a lot of unsealing work, a lot of public records work to help reporters for free do that kind of research for their stories, for their investigative pieces, precisely because it's so vitally important. It's critically important to the work that they're doing. I think, you know, one of the things I would say is that these are the kinds of when we could have an entire panel, right, on talking about local, the need for more support for local reporting, investigative reporting, and enterprise reporting, and different potential solutions to that. I think one of the things that you get from the film, especially, is even though USA Gymnastics is in USA, it was a national story. It's a national. It's a national organization. It was so interweaved with the culture of Indianapolis that it really was a local story, and the way that it almost couldn't have started. It almost could not. That story could not have. I mean, I'd love to hear Marisa's thoughts on this, but I don't think that story would have happened if it wasn't the Indy Star digging into it. What was in effect, you know, an Indianapolis-based company, right, or organization, and so when we lose the sort of resources for news organizations that are at in mid-sized markets or smaller markets to be able to do that kind of investigations. We're not do those kinds of investigations. Not only are we losing, you know, reporting on city and state governments, it's really important to do, but we also lose some of these national stories that have not only a national effect, but really a worldwide global effect. And so I think, you know, this is a story that I use as an example of why it's so important to support local enterprise and investigative reporting that's being done in places other than, stories that are being done in places other than New York and DC and LA maybe.
Yeah, I shudder to think about all the stories we're losing, as you mentioned, for sure. We have an interesting question in the chat that I want to address, and it's basically about tactics and methods of organizing long-term investigative projects like these, because you can quickly and easily get overwhelmed by documents, by interviews with sources, combing through, verifying. So Marisa, can you talk a little bit about your strategies?
Oh gosh, I hope I don't overwhelm anyone. I love organizing, so. We use a lot of different tools. So I would say, starting sort of more basic and going into a little bit more broad without boring all of you, there were 3 people working on this investigation. We were all gathering information. And so we had, whether you do it in Google, we did it in OneDrive, you have a shared folder that everyone can access, and you have subfolders on specific things. So when we were gathering 990s, or we were gathering, we would have a folder for financial documents. If we were gathering information relating to people who were accused, we had that in a separate place. And so just starting very basic, right? We had a folder that all of us had access to that we could dig into whatever that we needed. And we also kept spreadsheets of people who were accused and histories and that sort of thing. If we were digging deep for an example, onto Larry Nassar, we created a timeline of his history and of allegations as we received them, fitting them into that timeline, and where he was and what was going on with his work at that time, all of that. Anyone that wants to email me, I'm super easy to find. I'm happy to share with you an example of a timeline and kind of the way that we do it, but we're just doing it in Word. In terms of organizing tasks, I like Trello. I know people have other things that they like. And I know, Paul, you had asked also about huge caches of documents. And we have been using more recently, we didn't use it for the USA Gymnastics investigation, but for the work that we have been doing now, Google Backlight has been really great in just saving everything into there. And then you can search for certain keywords if you're trying to find a document. Anybody who's done long-term investigative work and gathered entirely too many documents knows you get to that point where you're writing and you need to verify that one sentence. And then you're like, where the heck did that sentence go? And so tools like that are fantastic. You know, we also keep kind of an ongoing sheet of sort of key information that we need. I realize that is entirely more than you want to know, but you know, those are sort of the basics of the tools that we use to try and keep track of everything, because we are, you know, in some cases, I've done investigations that have lasted years. And, you know, for USA Gymnastics, our first piece published 4.5 months later, but we had still gathered and backgrounded hundreds of coaches and gathered lots of information in that period of time.
Can you remind us, Marisa, how many pieces came out after the first, you know, story, and then over what time period? Can you remember? Not to put you on the spot and quiz you, but
it's all a bit of a blur. You know, a lot of articles. I would say probably dozens. I honestly have no idea. You know, the first piece came out August 4th of 2016. The first piece about Nassar came out in mid-September of 16. But overall, I mean, there were stories in between those two. There were articles that came after that. I honestly have no idea how many.
But good example of, you know, this that stretches out the timeline from it's not over with the first story, obviously. I think we all know that, but it's important to remember. I mean, this is dozens of articles later, right? Can you say whether you're still working on leads from this particular investigation?
I don't know if I can. I am working on an investigation in which elements are similar, but not specific to gymnastics. I do have colleagues who are continuing to follow the gymnastics investigation. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, and the film, as again, not to try to give anything away, but the film leads us to a place where we can assume that more is to come about, you know, USA Gymnastics, the culture, and more. Let's talk a little bit about, we mentioned earlier that the gymnasts, the survivors themselves got a lot of vitriol aimed at them, but in the film, so did the journalists, right? That was a brief moment. I want to mention just the dynamics that are at play right now. 4 years ago was a long time ago, in terms of how the culture has shifted, sometimes in opposition to media and journalists. And, you know, we can take criticism, you know, not a problem, right? But the opposition there now is getting very strong. And especially when it comes to investigative reporting, I want to talk about threats to journalism, threats to journalists individually, what that crisis looks like, you know, what we can be aware of, what the solutions might be. Again, that's a whole other panel, but maybe we can address just a few things in a few minutes.
I mean, I'm happy to take the first stab at that. So one of the things that we see endemic now to journalism, especially if you're reporting on any sort of sensitive topic, which these days could really be anything, or if you're a woman, or if you are Black, Jewish, a minority, really any sort of non-dominant identity, and especially if you have an intersectional identity, that you will most likely experience online harassment. We say online harassment, but that actually comprises of many different types of things. It could mean doxing, the sharing of your personal information online. It could mean a barrage of hate, of threats. And what we see with women reporters is that oftentimes those are sexualized and include threats of rape. That can also then, of course, be directed at sources as well. And we see that sometimes these are organized by groups of people, for example, during Gamergate, organized against female tech reporters. So one of the things that we advise journalists who are working on, I mean, really any topic, is to do a threat assessment. And part of that should be, what sort of digital security do you need to put in place in order to, say, lock down your social media accounts, certainly locking down any of the platforms that Marisa mentioned about the collaboration platforms that you're using, how to secure your devices, thinking about what sort of personal information exists online about you, photos, things like that. We have a pretty extensive set of safety advisories for journalists on digital security, on online harassment, et cetera. They're on our website, cpj.org. But the big takeaway is online harassment of some form is endemic now to journalism. It can also, of course, lead to offline harassment and offline threats. And unfortunately, we are the Committee to Protect Journalists, and we see attacks on journalists every day in retaliation for their reporting. When you are taking on powerful institutions, and let's talk about sports in particular, because there is a major corruption problem in FIFA, for example, in the when the Olympics are taking place in Russia or China, the reporters trying to report on the staging or the setup or the conduct of the Olympics are under extreme threat. And there's this intersection with what they're reporting on, because the human rights violations or the environmental degradation or assaults or abuse of athletes, all of these are really sensitive subjects. And so it's really important that reporters are able to do those investigations and to talk to those people, but it's also really important that they take it seriously, knowing that both they need to keep themselves and their sources safe.
Kenny, did you have thoughts from a legal perspective?
Sure, and I agree with everything that Courtney said, and CPJ has some great resources. Freedom of the Press Foundation also has some great resources on digital security for journalists who are looking to protect source communications and other communications and other information about them online. I think I'd add to that, the only thing I would really add to that is that what we've seen at the Reporters Committee, because we are a legal services organization, is really an uptick in use of legal process in a threatening way against journalists, subpoenas to journalists, an increase in subpoenas to journalists in civil litigation, for example, threats of lawsuits for liability, particularly in cases that have a sexual harassment or sexual assault component. You tend to see journalists receive very threatening cease and desist letters or threats of litigation, and including lawsuits, not just threats. So I think that's another sort of area, the sort of use of the legal system to sort of silence reporting is something that it's certainly not new, but I think we've seen an uptick in that. And I think part of the reason, some respect, we've seen an uptick in that is that attitudes towards the media, and you've alluded to this before, attitudes towards news media in general have sort of shifted in a way that, certainly not among everyone, but there is an element, I think, of distrust in the media that maybe we didn't perhaps see to the same level to the same level at least 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that has, and there's also a sort of a politicization of the news media, or the use of the news media as sort of a foil for certain political positions that I think has also kind of exacerbated the sort of threats, particularly the legal threats that are aimed at journalists. So it makes it just, in a nutshell, a more dangerous, in kind of every sense of the word, dangerous profession to be engaged in, to kind of tell truth to power as a reporter in this day and age.
Yeah. And I understand why some of that distrust has become stronger, but also the criticism, when it tips over into harassment, whether it's personal, legal, or otherwise, it creates a chilling effect, obviously. And that's dangerous for our democracy and for journalism. Marisa, I'm just wondering if you ever experienced a little bit of that chilling effect yourself. Obviously, you and your colleagues were very committed to this story and kept moving. If you did, just based on some of the vitriol that came your way, how did you deal with that?
You know, we largely did not. I mean, you know, when our first piece about USA Gymnastics and their handling of child sexual abuse allegations came out, you know, they did issue a statement that said they felt that we hadn't presented the full picture of what they were doing, which ended up being true. Maybe not in the way that they meant it, but, you know, they issued that statement, but there was nothing really that they were pointing toward. There were no inaccuracies, nothing that was actually wrong with it. So that was sort of the first pushback, which was honestly quite mild in terms of, you know, what others may experience. We also got some pushback with our first piece on Nassar, and we had people who would call and say that, you know, we were wrong, that he was a great man and that people were putting these false allegations against him. But again, it was largely mild, and all of those criticisms really went away after he was charged with possession of child pornography. You know, I think that the survivors, getting back to sort of the original point, Rebecca, that you were making, had it a lot worse than we as journalists did. And, you know, that is one of, when I talk earlier about communication, that is one of the things that we do have to unfortunately talk about, is preparing them to understand the potential of what could happen after publication. And it's a really difficult conversation to have, but it's better to have it at the front end and make sure that people are prepared. As an example, you see in the film, Jamie Dancher speak about her experiences. And when we initially published the piece about her, she was a Jane Doe. She had not yet come forward publicly. But, you know, we had a conversation with her prior to publication and said, you know, we want to make sure that you understand that just because we're not naming you doesn't mean that people might not figure out who you are. And these facts that you want us to put out there may identify you even though we do not. And she understood that, and she said, I think this story is important, and I think the public needs to know about it.
And maybe I can just jump in on that as well. I mean, what really this film emphasized is how important journalists and the people who are, you know, affected by abuse or experiencing human rights violations are facing. And, you know, I had a chance to meet Jessica Howard, who was also in the film, at the annual conference of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, which the Committee to Protect Journalists is a founding member of, because so much of revealing abuse, again, we're talking about sexual abuse in this film, but, you know, in Qatar, there have been thousands of workers who have died constructing the stadiums for the World Cup. In Russia and China, the environmental degradation and destruction of local communities to make way for Olympic villages and other things, you know, these are really mutually inclusive. It's very hard to get justice, either if you're not believed, and, you know, we're in a democratic system here, but imagine if you're in a non-democratic system where one of your only mechanisms of justice is the media. And I think it's interesting to see that major sporting bodies are increasingly cognizant that they have a responsibility to respect human rights. And we're seeing, for example, that the Olympics has now adopted a human rights framework for its bidding process, FIFA as well. And I think we need to put this sort of pressure and link up kind of the way we talk about this domestically, which we rarely use the kind of terminology human rights. It's always about like this global thing out there. But, you know, the human rights of these women athletes, of these children athletes, were violated by those entrusted to care for them. And we are seeing more mechanisms created to try to hold those people accountable. And I would just urge people to, you know, look out there. We started the Sports and Rights Alliance, which gets what we called affected groups, the workers, the athletes, the journalists, everyone who's affected by these sporting events, because there are lots of different parties involved, because we really believe that, you know, sports should be fun, but, you know, there shouldn't be human rights abuses and abuses against children and athletes that are any part of the sporting experience.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think so many untold stories that with more resources, more support from organizations like yours, and others, we could be telling those truths and holding the powerful accountable. I realize that we're at the end of our appointed time here. I just want to take a moment to really celebrate and recognize the survivors who came forward to make these stories possible. Just the end of that film, and towards the end, when you see all the survivors make their victim impact statements at the Larry Nassar trial, just so inspiring, right? And also, thank you to Marisa and you and your colleagues for bringing this story forward. Also inspiring, and I hope that journalists who are watching today take some of the tips and resources and insights and try to dig deeper, even if there are fewer resources than we would like, to make more of these stories possible, to hold more people powerful, accountable, and to restore the human rights, right, of the people who are being abused or experiencing sexual violence in situations where it is and should be unacceptable. So I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks to all of you. I'm so grateful for your time and insight.